The man was out hunting when he stumbled upon a wild woman. She was bathing right in the middle of the river. Just as he was watching with great interest, the wild woman suddenly snatched up a large fish, and in the very next second, she began devouring it ravenously, instead of being frightened by what he saw. Chris was strangely captivated by the primal energy of this woman. In fact, he felt an overwhelming urge to conquer her. He quietly followed her all the way. After confirming the location of her cave, Chris had a disturbing thought. Determined to claim the wild woman as his own, he hid above the cave. He waited until the wild woman went out to hunt for food. Seizing the right moment, Chris cast a fishing net. He knocked the wild woman unconscious, then hurriedly carried her back home. He firmly chained her limbs to keep her restrained. Chris had been unable to contain his curiosity any longer. He cautiously approached and began examining the mysterious wild woman. Years of dirt and grime covered her body. A strong, pungent odor instantly overwhelmed his senses. Even so, beneath the dirt, her features were strikingly beautiful. Chris leaned in to inspect her discolored teeth. But just then, the wild woman suddenly woke up. In a flash of instinct, she bit down hard on his finger. Chris screamed in pain, staggering backward in shock. Furious and hurt, he lashed out in frustration. The wild woman glared at him with unshaken defiance. Frustrated, Chris stormed off to tend to his injury. In order to eliminate the wildness from the woman, Chris, after dressing her wounds, approached her once again. First, he put on a pair of noise-canceling earmuffs. Then he pulled out a handgun and fired a shot right next to her ear. The deafening blast instantly caused the wild woman's ears to ring violently. She lashed out at Chris in a burst of fury. Seeing this, Chris calmly raised the gun again. Only then did the wild woman fall silent. Next, Chris brought his family to the storage room. He told them he was going to help strip the wildness out of her. His two daughters looked confused, unable to understand the purpose behind their father's actions. Only the eldest son, Brian, stared curiously at the wild woman in front of him. To help the wild woman eat like a normal human, Chris specifically asked his wife, Belle, to bring over a bowl of rice, but the wild woman, who was used to eating raw fish and meat, had absolutely no interest in this kind of food. In a burst of rage, she slammed her head into the bowl, knocking it over. Chris then warned his family that everything happening here must be kept secret from the outside world. Seeing how ungrateful the wild woman was, Chris had no choice but to take his family and leave for now. He decided to starve her for 10 days, maybe even 2 weeks, in hopes of grinding down her wild nature. But what he didn't realize was that this very decision would end up costing them their lives, because this woman was no ordinary savage. She was a wolf girl raised by wolves since childhood. Her speed and strength were far beyond anything they could imagine. During dinner, everyone sat in silence. Belle asked just one question, and Chris responded by slapping her across the face. Meanwhile, the wild woman locked in the storage room never stopped fighting for her freedom. She kept pulling at the ropes, desperately trying to break free, but failed each time. She continued to struggle like this, until her strength slowly began to fade. At her feet lay a pile of leftover food scraps, now rotted and covered in decay. Finally, the wild woman gave in, lowering her head, and began to hungrily gnaw at the rotten food. Early the next morning, the whole family carried buckets of water into the storage room. They planned to clean the filth off the wild woman's body. Brian, the eldest son, wanted to help when he saw what was happening, but Chris immediately kicked him out. Chris then put on a pair of gloves and began scrubbing the years of grime from the wild woman's skin. However, after only a short while, he realized the dirt on her body was as thick as a fortress wall. Simple scrubbing wasn't going to work at all. To completely remove the filth, the deranged Chris decided to take an extreme approach. Chris then took the wild woman outside. In the next second, he pointed a high-pressure water hose at her. To wash off the years of grime on her body, he began blasting her with the powerful stream. Under the intense pressure of the water, the layers of filth on the wild woman's skin started to come off. This immediately filled Chris with joy, but the wild woman, overwhelmed by the force of the water, suddenly found herself unable to breathe. As she was on the verge of collapse, the eldest daughter, Peggy, rushed over and shut off the valve. What she didn't realize was that this very action would later end up saving her life. Seeing that Chris still didn't want to stop, the wild woman, in desperation, opened her mouth and begged him to stop. Chris was so shocked and excited by the fact that she could speak that he finally stopped what he was doing. Chris then ordered Belle to dress the wild woman in clean clothes. looking at the woman now properly clothed. Chris felt deeply satisfied. As the days slowly passed, the wild woman's temperament began to soften. When Chris offered her food, she gladly accepted it and ate without resistance. Chris gently patted her head with pride, praising her as his good little girl. But when night fell, and his wife Belle had drifted off to sleep, Chris quietly slipped out of bed. He snuck into the storage room without making a sound. What he didn't know was that Belle wasn't actually asleep. She knew exactly what her husband was going to do. Unbeknownst to Chris, the moment he entered the storage room, his eldest son Brian quietly followed behind. Through the crack in the door, Brian silently watched everything happening inside. Chris undressed the wild woman, then proceeded to do things that cannot be described. Afterwards, Chris casually lay back down on his bed as if nothing had happened. His wife's heart was filled with unbearable pain. The next day, while their parents were out, the boy sneaked into the storage room and approached the wild woman in an attempt to lower her guard. He took out some cookies and tried to feed her, but the wild woman showed no interest in the cookies, determined to make her submit to him as well. The boy decisively grabbed a pair of pliers, planning to use violence to conquer the wild woman. Peggy heard the cries and rushed over immediately. She stormed into the storage room and stopped her brother's twisted behavior. Fortunately, the wild woman only had a few teeth pulled out and was not in any life-threatening condition. Peggy then quickly told their mother, Belle, what had happened. Belle was furious when she heard the news. She warned her son never to set foot in the storage room again, but just at that moment, Chris happened to come home from work. His wife hoped Chris would discipline their son. To her surprise, Chris didn't care at all. He believed it was normal for a boy going through puberty to be curious about women. Belle completely broke down after hearing this. She blamed her husband for their son's disgusting behavior. She could no longer tolerate this perverted man. She declared that she wanted a divorce immediately. She planned to take their 2 daughters and leave. Unexpectedly, this instantly enraged Chris. He violently attacked Belle. He beat her unconscious right then and there. But just at that moment, there came a sudden knock at the door. It was the female neighbor who had come by. Peggy tried her best to stop the neighbor from coming inside. At that point, Chris walked over and invited the neighbor in. The neighbor complained that there were always sharp, piercing noises coming from Chris's house, which seriously disturbed her baby's sleep. She hoped Chris could keep the noise down when at home. Unexpectedly, these words pushed Chris, already feeling frustrated, over the edge. In a sudden rage, he slapped the neighbor unconscious. Then, Chris dragged the female neighbor toward the storage room. Seeing this, Peggy stepped forward, pleading desperately, begging him to release the neighbor, but her father refused to listen. Instead, he shoved her to the ground. He warned Peggy that if she dared to interfere again, he would lock her up. After warning his daughter, Chris dragged the female neighbor into the kennel inside the storage room. What the neighbor didn't expect was that not only were vicious dogs kept there, but also a woman was imprisoned. In the next moment, the woman bit the female neighbor to death. Witnessing this scene, Peggy could no longer tolerate her father's cruelty. She immediately went to another storage room and decisively freed the wild woman. Now reborn, the wild woman was ready to begin her hunt. Meanwhile, Belle slowly regained consciousness. She heard agonized screams coming from the storage room, so she cautiously moved toward the source of the noise. Just as she reached the door of the storage room, she ran straight into the wild woman. Enraged, the wild woman immediately grabbed Belle and threw her to the ground. Then, following the sounds, the wild woman headed into another storage room. When she saw Chris and his son Brian there, the wild woman struck Brian down with a single blow from a wooden stick. Seeing this, Chris tried to fight back, but before he could react, the wild woman pierced his body with the same stick. Just as the wild woman was about to leave, another prisoner followed closely behind. It turned out she was also a victim. Chris had kept her locked in the dog kennel for a long time, causing her every move to resemble that of a dog. Eventually, the wild woman managed to tame her. Afterward, the wild woman headed toward the house. Inside, Peggy was still thinking about leaving with her sister. To her surprise, her sister showed no fear at all. She even took the initiative to approach the wild woman. She went so far as to offer the wild woman some water to drink. Only then did the wild woman realize that these 2 sisters were kind-hearted people, and not cruel like their father. Then, the wild woman slowly extended her bloodied palm right in front of her younger sister. The innocent and curious sister began to suck on it. Next, The wild woman reached out her fingers toward Peggy, but Peggy refused, keeping her mouth shut. Realizing that Peggy did not intend to come with her, the wild woman reluctantly grabbed her younger sister's hand and headed toward the forest. From that day forward, the younger sister would become her successor, living a life of raw meat and survival. And with that, the film came to its close.